Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Itinerary AI podcast. I'm your host, Matthews. Today, we're diving into a topic that affects every single person who goes to work: burnout, but not in the way you might expect. Our conversation today is called Burnout by Design: How the Modern Workspace is Wired Against Human Performance. My guest today is Andrew Stevenson. But before we continue, please tell us about yourself, who you are, what company you're representing, and tell us a bit more about the background of it.
Yeah, thanks, Matthews, and thank you very much for having me too. It's fun to have a conversation, and thanks for spreading this information to people. I think it's hopefully helpful for listeners and people who are involved in business, particularly, I think, people leaders. They need to understand some of this stuff. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. So my name's Andrew. I am the Vice President of North America for a company called HBD International, which is also a company called Health by Design. We originated in Australia about 30 years ago. I think this is our 30th anniversary. That's cool. And we work in the area of workplace health and wellness, but also high performance. So we have, for a very long time worked with organizations to help do health promotion on site, to help improve the health and well-being of their employees, to help reduce injuries, to help, improve mental well-being as well. And we've also worked with executives and executive teams. We used to work a lot more kind of one-on-one with executives to help them with building and managing their own health and resilience so that they can maintain a higher level of high performance for a sustained time, And particularly in the last few years, but particularly post-COVID, we've always had an interest in neuroscience. We've been doing neuroscience assessments with executives for probably 15, 20 years. And we use that information to help the executive understand themselves as an individual, and then executive teams, how they could optimize working together. But more and more, we've started to realize that it's not just about the executive managing themselves. They have to have an understanding of how they manage and lead and how that impacts other people. So a lot of our more recent work with executives has been helping them understand how the brain works, not just in themselves, but also in others, so that they can understand how the psychosocial environment in a workplace impacts people's ability to thrive, to be healthy, but also to be motivated and to have high performance and to sustain high performance longer term. So, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's a very good intro. Have you seen any developments past COVID in what your company does to executives? Has there been an increased usage of your model that you're using or participants?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, through COVID and post-COVID, executives were struggling themselves, right? They absorbed a lot of pressure in COVID. They still had the pressures from shareholders, from higher management, whoever's controlling them, to push that we have to pivot quickly and adapt and still function as an organization. But at the same time, they were hearing all the issues and problems and absorbing the stress of people below them, right? So they kind of got sandwiched in the middle. And I think that took a lot of toll on them, because not only you've got to remember they were dealing with the same situation, right?
Yeah.
We all of a sudden went from an environment where we were very comfortable doing our day-to-day and living our lives to an environment that was inherently stressful and threatening. We didn't know. And the brain learns by patterns, right? And when we get comfortable in an environment, it's because we know that there's predictable patterns. And all of a sudden we were in an environment, even if we were in our own home or our local community or our office that was normally felt quite safe, there was this heightened background level of threat, right? So they were dealing with the same thing as everyone else, and they had to manage their own stress as well as all the extra corporate stress. So we started getting asked a lot from executives for help themselves, but also they were very much wanting to help their people. And I think that's why we sort of transitioned from pre-COVID working a lot one-on-one with executives to more post-COVID working with helping executives understand the environment they create and how that impacts the employees, because they were looking for opportunities to mitigate stress within their teams, which was a bit of a different swing. So that's kind of
Yeah.
how the services and demand changed, I think, after that.
Okay, that's very interesting. So there's been a very drastic change post-COVID and to where we are at the moment, 2026. And
Yeah.
since you spent years, you said this is your 30th anniversary.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
me. I'm not that old. Just as a company.
Yes.
But I've been working in this role for about 20 years across several different countries. So yeah,
Yeah.
I certainly am racking up the years myself.
Wonder initially when you joined and when you understood what the company actually does, what made you realize that burnout and poor health were not individual problems, but actually a design problem?
Yeah. So the fundamental thing that is easy for people to understand and makes complete sense in informing that change in perception, not the individual, but a system problem, is knowing that the nervous system doesn't respond to intention, it responds to the environment, right?
Yes.
You put a person or an animal or a thing in a certain environment, they're immediately assessing threat, right? So even if you tell yourself you're in a safe place, if your body senses otherwise, you're going to feel the reactions of that threat response, right? So I think for a long time, organizations, the evolution of health promotion and wellness and well-being in workplaces, I think early on employers they maybe didn't know their responsibility. They kind of thought, well, it's not our job to tell people how to live their life, so maybe it's just we'll give them some resources, and if that helps them, then that's us doing a good job. And I think that carried in, for the first kind of 15, 20 years of kind of workplace wellness was essentially just giving people resources, but it was kind of up to them if they used it or not. Then as the US, in response to the US healthcare system and the way that the employee benefits work, it became more of an organizational strategy to then try and mitigate the costs, right? So they got a little more aggressive in terms of trying to make people use the resources they were putting there. They got frustrated that they're putting resources out and people weren't using them. So then you got incentives and all sorts of things going in there. But ultimately, it was still always about, giving people access to things that they could use to try and help them manage their own health. It's only really, I think, more recently. And, I think really the department or industry that carried this forward was safety, EHS, Environment, Health and Safety Managers. They started to realize that, and part of it's because of their requirements to provide a safe work environment, but they started to realize we can't just tell people to be safer. We actually have to build systems and a work environment which mitigates the risk, right? They had to do hazard identification and reduce that. I think now we're starting to realize that the same thing is happening in psychological safety, right? We can't just tell people to be healthy, but then put them in an environment that ultimately undermines those efforts at being healthy. I think there's a realization that if we give people resources as well as put them in an environment which supports the use of those resources, then you're able to escalate the outcomes you get from that. So I think that's more the shift, is this idea that resources on their own aren't necessarily helpful if people are not in a culture and environment that supports the use of those resources.
And have you seen what would you say has been the adoption of the last couple of years of where you give people the resources to actually look at it? How are they?
Yeah, it's still slow, I think. I think there's a lot of opportunity for organizations that are forward thinking. I think we've been very reactive, right? So the post-COVID, which was entirely predictable, regardless of the workplace environment, we always knew that there was going to be a mental health kind of wake that happened after that, because if you go through trauma, you can you can't push the stress system forever, right? You can have withheld periods of high stress, but then you need periods of recovery. And through extended trauma or group trauma and things like that, which COVID was, you had the big heightened level of stress for a while. There was always going to be a burnout type period where you had to crumble back down and then recover and build up again, right? So we knew that was coming. And so I think the response has been reactive. So while that burnout phase has happened and part of the rebuild, there's been more people in distress, more higher rates of anxiety and depression and things like that. Burnout obviously has got a lot of news. So then resources were put in place to deal with people that were in crisis, right? But they haven't been put in place for prevention. They've been more reactive. So giving people access to, increasing EAP access and increasing mobile mental health support and things like that. So there's been a lot of mental health first aid training for managers and things like that. There's a lot of focus on managing people in crisis, but I think we're still very slow and early in the adoption of switching that to doing things that are proactive to prevent people getting to crisis, which kind of follows the same arc and a level of adoption as preventive health did, right?
Yeah.
We're still working in managing disease conditions and not great at the prevention side. I think we're in that same boat now with mental well-being. There's a lot of talk about it, but most of the real-world application is still focused on crisis management and still lagging in the prevention area.
That's a very good insight from what you actually do and the patterns you've noticed that are happening. Say when you enter a new organization, what are some of the early signs that you realize that this workspace is quietly burning out its people? What are some of the things that you look at?
Yeah, you could probably answer that question, and anyone listening can. I think you've all walked into a place and you can see it on people's faces, right? You can see their posture, you can see people look exhausted, people are not motivated, there's not a lot of chatter, everyone's got, their own earbuds in, they're all doing stuff. I think it's pretty obvious when you walk into a workplace whether it's a thriving workplace or a struggling workplace. But then you can get signs through just looking at the employees and their body language and how active they are is a simple sign. But then if you stay longer and you can look around, you can see things in the environment, right? You can watch whether people are interacting at high levels or not. If people are not interacting, that's a sign that they're probably kind of just the effort of being social is more than they have the bandwidth for, so they're just struggling themselves. The way that managers interact with people, whether they're just going to people to tell them to do stuff or to correct them for something or ask for something, or whether they're going up and kind of sitting with them and chatting with them a little more. There's subtle signs. The environment, whether it's bright, whether it's dark, whether it's loud vibrations or whether they're mitigating some of that stuff. So those are subtle things, but like I said, the nervous system responds to the environment, not the intention. So if you're in a stressful environment that's dark, dull, you've got poor food choices around you, you've got people that are not interacting, we're wired for social connection. If you're in an environment where you're not socially connected, that can also have your defenses up, right? So there's a lot of subtle things that are going on, but it's usually pretty obvious when you walk in. I think you could probably pick the difference too.
Yes. But some companies have tried bringing up different systems, either activities that coworkers can actually do, and I'm sure you've done either surveys or research on this, and you have insight on what are companies actually doing and that are not working. What are things that I would say is a typical organization that are trying to make their employees better interactive, socially interactive, improve their mental health? What do you think are some of the things that they're doing that are not working?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, there might not be a single answer, right? Because different organizations operate differently. So what works in one organization may not work as well in another organization. And whether you have people present at work, whether you have them hybrid, whether they're completely remote, they're different environments, right? So they might have different needs. But I think there's a lot of it comes down to, if you think about what makes the brain comfortable and what helps feed energy and motivation and innovation versus what is likely to drive stress and demotivation and those types of things. And then you look at which organizations are doing which ones, you can kind of start to pick some out. And things that kind of, are going to be detrimental longer term to people's stress state and their ability to maintain energy and performance are going to be things when they have, unrelenting pressure, when they have unpredictability, a lack of control, They don't feel psychological safe, which means they don't necessarily feel safe to put forth ideas. They don't feel socially connected. They don't feel connected to a purpose. People need to find that what they're doing is meaningful in order to engage brain rewards to do tasks. If you think what you're doing doesn't really matter, then your motivation to do that is very low, and the satisfaction you get from it and the positive elements of mental well-being that come from feeling a sense of purpose are all gone. So when you kind of break a lot of those things down, it doesn't matter whether people are in there in person or whether they're remote. A lot of it comes down to the way that communication and interactions happen between people. And a lot of that is controlled by leaders and management. So it's the workplace culture. It's the way that people connect socially and lift each other up. It's the way that whether teams have easy access to each other, whether they feel some kind of personal connection within each other, whether they feel like they're in a growth-oriented environment versus an environment where they're punished for doing things wrong, right? If they're in an environment where their workloads are completely unrealistic, then that means they're kind of constantly failing at things, right? If the expectations can never be met, then you're inevitably always falling short. That just crushes our brain reward system, right? Because you constantly have unmet expectations, right? And you develop learned helplessness, which is this sense that it doesn't actually matter now where the bar is set. You just get used that you're probably going to fall short of it, right?
Yes.
And so a lot of it comes down to managers. The managers and the way they lead and communicate, they need to build in time within team meetings and things to be human, right? They have to treat people as humans first, put producers second. And that's counter to the way I think a lot of managers were normally sort of trained, because it feels soft and touchy-feely. It feels like they're not there to be their friends. I'm there to make sure they work hard. Well, actually, the thing that's going to make them work hard is if they feel socially supported and mentored, right?
Yes.
So it's counterproductive. Managers might not think that that stuff is a good investment in time, but actually it's probably a better investment in time than just telling people what to do and pushing them and reprimanding them when they don't do it, right? So it's asking, it's getting to know people a little bit personally, obviously, without crossing lines, but making people feel heard. It's learning to recognize how different individuals like to get feedback, right? And some people are going to want recognition in front of a team because they really will have a really elevated brain reward from that. Some people, that's very embarrassing to them, and it actually it sets off threat responses, right? So learning a little bit about trying to identify, this person's going to really appreciate if I send them a short email thanking them. This person's going to really appreciate it if I thank them in the next team meeting. Taking a bit of time to learn and understand a little bit about their family or their hobbies, and not wasting time with it, but just asking sometimes, starting a conversation with, hey, how's, Rex going at soccer, whatever,
Yes.
that little bit of human connection. And the data would support that, right? You look at sort of Gallup polls and you look at research into high trust organizations, right? If people feel connected socially, innovation goes up, productivity goes up, safety incidents go down, employee engagement goes up. All of those things happen when people feel like they have a purpose, they have, realistic expectations, and they have the support they need to get work done.
Now, would you say that's a very good point? But will you say this might vary in different industries or different, say, personality types? Some people might prefer a stern leader, say a stern manager, get work done. Some would prefer to be more softer. Hi, how are you? Some would prefer, okay, get this job done, meet your KPIs. But some leaders have expectations also from their leaders. Managers have expectations from their directors. And that flow chart just goes all the way down. It's not to their expectation, or it's not what they want to do, but they're forced to do it. How would you relate this in a workspace? How would you approach it as a HBD International?
Yeah, it's a really good question, good insight. And it's really quite challenging at an individual manager or leader level with that, because that's that's where the system versus the individual problem comes. Because if an organization, I think one of the biggest reasons that a lot of organizations don't think workplace wellness works or that their wellbeing strategies don't work is because they're giving people resources, but then not putting them in an environment that encourages them to use them, right? There was a study a few years ago from the McKinsey Health Institute that a global study in all different countries, kind of all the same thing was found. So this is a human problem, not a cultural problem, that they wanted to know whether organizations that provided their employees with really good access to health resources had less issues with stress, burnout, and disengagement. And the answer was, ultimately that organizations that provided their employees with good access to health resources tended to have slightly healthier employees. So that was good.
Yes.
But they had no difference in burnout, disengagement, turnover, and impacts on productivity related to stress when they had a toxic culture, right? So I think a lot of organizations have tried to, they're trying to give people resources, but they haven't addressed their legacy culture and the way they work. So if the pressure from above is still get it done, push it out, I don't care about how they feel. And literally, I spoke to an organization a couple of weeks ago that they're a tech company. They have a lot of remote employees, so they have issues with just kind of disconnect and stuff anyway. And they've had a lot of issues with mental well-being and a lot of turnover. And some parts of their leadership are saying we need to start to embed elements of kind of well-being into our culture. We need managers to know some of this stuff. And we have other parts of their management leadership that just said, this is a tough industry and it's cutthroat. And if they can't hack it, then we'll find someone who can, right?
Yeah.
And so when you're dealing with that kind of legacy thinking within leadership, it's really hard to tell individual managers further down the chain to fix the well-being problem, right? Because ultimately the culture and the values of the organization are not aligned with the behaviors that are necessary to improve the outcomes. So for organizations that are thinking about doing this stuff, they need to really look at their values and not just what's written on the wall, but the way that they live and operate to their values. And if they genuinely value innovation, performance, and looking after their people, then it has to start there before they filter down all the activities that go down below it.
So you would
If
say,
you've got organizations which are pushing that message of just do it, and if they need help, call the AAP, it's not going to change.
you first of all suggest just clean the legacy and make sure it's all clean before.
Yeah, and I don't mean that they get rid of people. I mean that those people need to be educated, and that's where I think the more mainstream that neuroscience is becoming, I think that's where it adds value, because a lot of managers have been told how important emotional intelligence is, right? Or they've had some leadership training, and then in Leadership 101, they get told it's important to create a growth environment. It's important to, not reprimand people too harshly. It's important that people feel recognized. It's important that people have a sense of autonomy. And they'll tick all those boxes and they'll listen to that in there. But then if the way they step out of that training is then to operate in a different way, or they themselves have a different operating style to the people they're working with, what they perceive as having some autonomy, is not actually what the people below them don't feel it, right? So there's also a real gap sometimes in kind of emotional intelligence and social awareness of some leaders. A lot of leaders have been elevated to their position because they're good operators, not necessarily because they're good people operators. And so they tend to then push the way that they do business or the way that they think is successful, which, sometimes is very threatening to people below them. So it's not about cleaning house. It's about those organizations that are struggling. When you sit leadership down and you show them the science and the evidence and you say, this is a brain that's in threat and this is a brain that's got an active prefrontal cortex and this is the brain that's going to create innovation and have energy and this is the brain that's going to create quality issues and errors and turnover, and you show them the little pieces, simplistically how the brain reward system works, how to engage people versus what's very disengaging to people, you use the evidence that they can't really deny to then give value to the skills that they previously thought were soft skills. And then they start to kind of go, okay, I kind of get it now. And it doesn't change overnight, but I think using the evidence starts to become pretty compelling to people that are pretty switched on, which most executives and leadership are.
Yeah, you've just touched about neuroscience and how how you give evidence to the leaders and managers, how you give them facts and how they can adopt it into their workspaces. My question is, where does the push harder mentality break down biologically with this evidence?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's tough because in our modern world, we really high rates of change, right? Everyone talks about pivoting, adapting, like constant change. The only thing that's constant is change, right?
Yeah.
So the speed and rate of business is a lot faster than it used to be. Guess what the brain doesn't really like? Unpredictability, right?
Yes.
So that's immediately stressful for a lot of people. A lack of control and a sense of pressure, these are all things that they're really unsustainable for people. The thing that they really need to understand, or the high pressure where it breaks down, it's biological, and it's the same. Your brain is it's a physiological muscle, and like any muscle, it gets fatigued, right? So if you think about running a marathon, you know that you can't sprint the whole way, right? You can have to set a pace which is sustainable, or you may have periods within the marathon where you can step it up, but if you try and maintain that, you're going to break down and fall out, right? You need to then, if you step it up for a bit, you're going to have a period where you taper back, right? And it's that oscillation between pushing when you need to and recovering when you need to, because the brain is the same sort of thing. The original threat response, right? A lot of people know flight or flight. They know the amygdala takes over and responds to threat and stress. But the brain doesn't necessarily tell the truth. It believes what you tell it, right? And in our modern world, even though you are in an actually safe environment, the perception of threat triggers the same biological response in the brain. So that constant pressure, the pinging of alerts, the always on mentality, you've always got your phone in your pocket, it's 10 o'clock at night, you should be off the clock, but it vibrates in your pocket, you can't help not look at it. All these things, they're all just kind of pushing that go, 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 go type buttons, right? And what happens is that system, that threat response system, was supposed to identify a threat, react quickly to the threat, get away from that threat, and then recover, right? And so people would be familiar with the initial response being the adrenal response, happens within milliseconds. And the other thing is that the threat response happens before people know it, right? Again, going back to that notion of the brain responding to the environment more than intention, right?
Yes.
You'll pick up on things. This is another thing for leadership too, and a reason that leaders need to understand how to manage their own stress response before they lead others. Because if a leader comes into a meeting or engages with someone and they're at an elevated threat level, even if they're trying to say things calmly, the person picks it up. We are very subconsciously adept at identifying emotional, in other people. And so, if there's a high stress environment, then it's going to put people in that high stress state themselves, even when they feel it or not. And it's going to tap out. That adrenal system is short-lived. Then cortisol kicks in for the longer term push. And that's not bad in periods, but we need recovery. If it's pushed all the time, then, cortisol is high, inflammation is high, and you get the trickle-down effects in terms of impact on cardiovascular system, impact on metabolic health, impact on cognitive function longer term. Sustained high cortisol and inflammation leads to a leaky blood-brain barrier, which also impacts brain health. If your cardiovascular health is compromised long term, then the flow of blood and nutrients to the brain is compromised long term. A lot of dementia, estimates are at a quarter or a third, I think maybe even higher, up to almost a half of dementia is cardiovascular related. It's because the brain cells are dying because they're not getting good support, right? So that whole pressure-based push, do more, you can't do it. You can't sprint forever. So leaders need to be smart in realizing, if they're trying to make everything a priority, then in reality, nothing's a priority, right? Because everything's there. So leaders have to be smart in really picking their battles, picking what are our actual priorities, and let's push that. And then being okay with some of the other things falling back, but making that the people that are working for them understand that this is the priority and I'm okay if these are not done perfectly, because it gives people a signal to push, have my best energy available when I need it, but then recover. And it's okay if these things don't get there, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. And you just talking, I was thinking, what are the patterns that you've noticed for a healthy, since past COVID, they've been work from home, some have pushed for 5 days on site. And has there been improvements with the work from home, or would you think that on site every day, Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 is still doable?
That's a really good question. A lot of organizations are struggling that. If you look at the research, you would say that a balance seems to be ideal, right? So I think a lot of the research has kind of shown that preferences for people and what seems to be the best is about 2 or 3 days in an office and, 2 or 3 days remote. But that's going to be a little different for different work environments and cultures. And also we have to understand that that's a privilege too, right? There are also so many workers who have no choice to work at home, right? So I actually think all the talk about people having this choice and the balance and the work from home is actually stressful for the people who don't have that choice. Like lack of control is one of the things that drives stress. I think people who don't have that choice are sick of hearing about it. Like they're like, I don't want to hear about your problems of picking how many days you want to go to work or what, So we need to be sensitive to that. But I think ultimately, I think particularly in the modern world where there's a premium in innovation and creative thinking, I think inherently teams are going to be more creative when they spend some time together. So that is a choice for organizations to make. Individual preferences, from surveys and things like that, seems most people seem happiest when they're getting maybe 2 or 3 days in the office, 2 or 3 days at home, but it sort of depends on the type of work you're doing. Some work is very individually focused. So if they spend more time at home, that's probably fine. It also depends on their home environment, right? So if you're trying to work, but you have 3 kids, you don't have appropriate daycare, your kids are sick from school, whatever, if you have stuff going on at home, that doesn't make it a good work environment either. So it's really individualistic. But I think organizations need to take a look at what do we value? Do we get value as an organization from teams thinking creatively, in which case fostering an environment or a work protocol that encourages them to spend some time together is probably productive. Whether it's other organizations that maybe that is less of a premium for them, then maybe they can be more flexible with people kind of choosing and working whatever. Does that help? I know I sat on the fence a little bit in that one. It's not a clear answer, but I think it's really individual, not only for people, but also organizations.
And what you do as your training and how you give them tools to the managers or to the employees, what is the adoption rate, how they take it back home? Say, as you just put an example, a person has got, say, 3 kids, no daycare. How do they put it when they go home? Say they have emotional intelligence. Does it go down to their kids also when they go to school, how they answer questions or their personal growth? How is it affected or the adoption rate?
Yeah, that's a good thought. I hope it has a really positive impact, a ripple effect outside of there, right? I think in the same way that if managers are always stressed, they're going to transfer that stress onto people below them. If people in the household are stressed, if parents are stressed, that has a ripple effect on the kids. So I think if people can make some of these changes and learn to prioritize and look after their own health and mental well-being, that makes them a better worker, a better colleague, but also makes them a better partner, parent, friend, right? I think it really has a big ripple effect, which is one of the reasons, that I kind of got into this work. I originally was in high performance, like personal training, and I had a kinesiology background in sports science and high performance, but I felt like that was a little, I don't know, not helping enough people achieve anything very significant. The ripple effect when you work with populations, you can have a positive impact. You can see health risks shift. in thousands of people. And then you also hear a lot of stories about people that say they took that information home and they've changed the whole way that their family lives and talks about some of this stuff. So I think the adoption rate is good, and people are motivated by different things. A lot of employees, they actually are more motivated to learn to manage stress and their well-being because it makes them a better person at home. The work stuff is secondary,
Yes.
I think there's a lot of that ripple effect too.
So where does technology come into this, and where does it help people make things worse when it comes to sustainable performance? What does tech come and all the AI hype and all what's happening around?
Look, it's exciting, but it's also really interesting because if you think about where just workplace wellness has been, not necessarily the neuroscience, but if you think of workplace wellness, it started out with biometric screening, like getting people to do health screenings and identifying who was at risk and who not, and then trying to get people that weren't healthy to do something different, right? That wasn't overly successful. They sort of realized that people needed more ongoing support or help. Then technology came. We started carrying around computers in our pockets and apps and things like that. We could track our sleep. We can track our steps. We can track, our heart rate variability. We could count our calories. We can do all this stuff. The promise of that was that, well, now we have all this data and information, it's going to be so much easier for people to do stuff. What actually happened is that I think we have, like a data overload, right? It became more overwhelming. And if you think also about how the brain works and brain reward systems, again, kind of unmet expectations is really damaging to brain reward centers. And so that is going to tend to lower people's motivation to try things. And so let's give everyone a step tracker and Fitbit and tell them to do 10,000 steps a day, knowing that the vast majority of people are not going to do 10,000 steps a day, which essentially means that every day they're getting a negative reinforcement that they didn't do enough. They start to then come beholden to the numbers. They start to lose motivation. They develop that learned helplessness we talked about. There's a little, if people haven't heard of it before, it's starting to become more mainstream, so they're definitely going to hear about it soon. There's a little thing called habenula in the brain. It's a little pea-sized thing, and it helps in regulating like mood and motivation and things like that. And what it really does is it suppresses the dopamine reward system. And people are probably familiar with the basics of dopamine tending to be a brain reward. Serotonin is another one. Dopamine tends to be a short-term brain reward. We seek quick dopamine hits. Serotonin is a longer burn, so longer reaching more fulfilling goals is more rewarding. It's the serotonin one. The serotonin brain reward system travels deeper throughout the brain than the dopamine one. So dopamine's a quick hit, but it's also a quick up and a quick down. Serotonin's much more fulfilling. A lot of people have longer term goals, but they struggle to do the behaviors to reach those because they get tempted by the little dopamine hits in between, right? So if you have a diet and you want to be good, but you see the cookie and the donut and the croissant, that's a much quicker reward and it's easy to do, and it's a sacrifice of this one, right? So this little habenula in there is important because when we're under chronic stress, it tends to down-regulate the dopamine reward system, which ultimately dopamine is massive in terms of motivation, right? So if we have this learned helplessness or this consistently never meeting expectations, we just start to lower those expectations and our motivation to keep trying gets less and less and less and less, right? So the promise of technology and apps in terms of health and wellness tracking is good for some people. They love that data and they use it and it's motivating for them. But for a large chunk of people, it just became optimization overload, right? It just showed them how often they weren't doing what they're told they're supposed to do. And it becomes like a demotivator, and the attrition rate on using those types of technologies is done. If we flip it now to the AI, this is where I think we're getting exciting, right? Because the type of data that you show people might be filtered based on understanding some of this neuroscience stuff. Like, let's just not give them everything and have people interpret it however they will. Maybe AI can get smarter in nudging people and showing them data when it might be better placed to give them a brain reward. So maybe the data is filtered and given to them selectively so it encourages progress versus, reinforcing negative outcomes. So there's information there. Now, there's apps and there's companies that have used AI for health coaching, right? I still think it's not there yet in terms of the personal connection. I think you can't beat that accountability to another person. But I do think where it could be used really appropriately in like now is to inform coaches better, right? So some coaches are naturally going to be better than others. Some coaches are going to recognize patterns in people or look at risk patterns in people's biomarkers and things like that. That pattern recognition is what AI is really great at right now. So plugging AI into the back end in database and looking at changes in people's biomarkers over time to then inform a coach in what types of behaviors are going to give that person the most value, I think is probably would be a really wonderful immediate use of that sort of technology. So I'm a little hesitant to kind of give it the thumbs up, right? Because we've seen this promise of technology before and it really actually wasn't very helpful. And sometimes I think the AI hype is a little the same, where it's like, oh, it's going to fix everything. Well, is it though? Like it's still going to struggle in some areas. Maybe it blows, completely beats my expectations and is a real game changer. But I do think there is real value in the processing ability that it has to really enhance and improve humans' ability to coach, because they don't have time to go through the data or recognize certain patterns that it can. So yeah, I think there's immediate use and potentially future use as well.
Potentially, as you said, we still need that human connection for someone to talk to, not just an AI companion on an app telling you your data is this and how you can better improve your daily activities. We still need that human and physical interaction with someone. And I think that would be...
I think there's something, and you'd probably, sorry to interrupt, it's the same feeling, if you've spoken to people on video and Zoom a bunch of times, but then you meet them, it feels different, right? There's something different about physically being near someone. And our brain has mirror neurons. Our heart and our brain give off electromagnetic pulses. The brain ones don't travel far from the brain because the skull holds them in, but our heart like if anyone wants to know how like an EKG works, they put the sensors around here and they're measuring that electromagnetic pulse that comes out. They're not connecting electrodes directly to the heart. They're measuring those radiating pulses. Pulses extend out 3-4 feet, and so I think there's stuff that we don't quite understand yet in terms of just physical connection to people and picking up on real subtle nuances in mood and mirror neurons and heart rates and just these electromagnetic things that I know sounds a little bit woo-woo, but there is some science that gets into this stuff that people fall into similar heart rates when they're together and things like that. So I think there's something to AI can't
really connect.
It's never going to quite be the same as talking to a real person who's flesh and blood and has that biological, connection.
Yeah, that's really essential in the modern days where everyone is doing Zoom calls, Google Meets, but then eventually when they meet up, there's a spark that happens or there's better interaction. And just on this note, in the previous years, in the early 2000s, since you've seen the rise of technology and how it was back then, would you prefer initial conversations of human mind, people to people, or is this just easier, the tech and AI and Zoom? Is it just easier, just convenience?
Again, I think it's situational. I think if I have the choice if I have the ability to see someone in person, I'll take that all the time. But sometimes you don't have that ability, so the video is the next best thing, right? And if say for a meeting for work, right, like if I have to drive 15 hours round trip for an hour meeting and then I miss family time and I miss my own ability to go exercise and be out in nature, do stuff because I'm sitting in a car driving or whatever, then the video meeting is actually healthier and better because it allows me to do all those other things, right? So it's a little bit give and take, but if I have the ability to see someone and it's not super disruptive to other things that are going on, I absolutely think there's more value in that. Maybe that's just me personally, but
yeah.
But I also, I live here in the US and I grew up in Australia, so my family's back there. So I live on Zoom and video chats all the time. It's definitely enhanced my ability to stay connected to people from afar. But yeah, I think if you have the choice and the opportunity, then there's a lot of value in getting in front of people.
It's perfect. And we're just winding up. I just have one last question for you. If a leader is listening to this today and wants to start somewhere, what is the one shift that would have the biggest impact on their team?
Good question. And I think ultimately it starts whenever we're working with leadership groups, and whether it's an individual executive or we're working with teams or we're working with managers and teaching them how to manage other people, it has to start with yourself. I know, which maybe sounds a little cliche, but this, again, the science is there, right? The mirror neurons, there's something we didn't really touch on earlier in conversation. There's something that we would call like automatic behaviors, right? Natural tendency behaviors. When people are stressed, right, and they're in that threat response, you tend to have less novel and creative thinking, right? You tend to revert to pattern recognition, and you do things that you've learned helps get you out of that threat response, right? So I mentioned earlier that a lot of leaders have elevated to their position because they're good operators, not necessarily good people. So often, they might be really like perfectionist, they have a higher quality work standard, or they're really task driven in the way that they do things, or they're good at taking action and just getting stuff done, or maybe they're good at dealing with a crisis, right? Organizations often reward the firefighters, right? Sometimes they put a shout out and say, don't forget the people that are preventing the fires. Don't just reward the firefighters. But those things tend to have been behaviors that people have gotten rewards out of in the past, right? So then when they get stressed themselves, the drive to revert to behaviors that feel comfortable and that have been rewarded in the past is actually escalated, right? So if you're a leader and you get stressed, but you don't understand how you respond to stress, or understand that some of the behaviors you're driven to when you're stressed are actually counterproductive to the rest of your team, then you're inadvertently kind of inhibiting your team's performance and stress and health without even knowing it, right? So introspection is key. You need to, for managers to be effective, they need to look at what stresses them, how they manage their stress, be aware that, and sometimes it's really hard to recognize, maybe you need a mentor or a colleague that sometimes you can check in with and go, hey, am I making a bigger deal out of this than I need? Or am I overthinking this? Am I making it seem like this thing that we need to get done is a higher priority than it is? Like, I think you need to check yourself, usually with external validation. Because when you're really stressed and your brain chemistry is skewed, you also have a negative skew. So your perception of what's going on can actually be skewed. So if you're operating in that style all the time, where your perceptions are skewed, your priorities are a little bit off, and you're overindulging in behaviors that make you feel comfortable but can actually be counterproductive to your team, then it's never going to work out well, right? So yeah, I think the step one for people is to really sit down and maybe find a mentor and ask them for honest feedback. Say, hey, when we're going at it, like when we're under the pump, what do you notice in me that changes, or what is counterproductive, right? Because maybe you don't have that insight. But if you can learn how you respond to stress and recognize when you're overindulging in those counterproductive behaviors, and then engage in stress mitigation techniques, and again, that's whatever works for you, right? For me, it is to go for a run, but I'm an active guy. Having that introspection and recognizing stress in yourself and how you deal with that stress. And if you learn to do that, you're 2/3 of the way to becoming a really effective leader. The other stuff that happens after that, the way that you communicate to your team, learning the differences in people's personality for different recognition and all that sort of stuff, those are really nice to have and they're of value, but you never get there if you are already sabotaging yourself because you're not managing your own stress and performance, right? So the number one step is learn yourself, take some introspection, find out what triggers you as stress, learn what helps you mitigate stress quickly, and have strategies for short-term circuit breakers as well as longer-term ones, right? So in the moment when you're stressful, you don't have time to go and do meditation or whatever it is, right? But maybe you can take a couple of deep breaths, or maybe you can walk to a window and just look outside the window and see the first thing that moves and gets your attention, and then focus on that thing for a couple of minutes and go, where's it going? What's it doing? What color is it? Anything you can do to re-engage the prefrontal cortex in a moment of stress is helpful, but then also learning to build a lifestyle which, has elements of health in it that help you be more resilient to stress in the first place. That's the longer term strategy. Short term circuit breakers, longer term strategy. Ultimately, learning how to manage and control your own stress is absolutely step one for being a good leader.
I think from this podcast, I've learned a lot from you than I even thought I would. This has been very insightful. There's some things I did not know I should actually do myself as a person. Take breaks, go out for a walk, see the birds in the sky. I mean, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Yeah.
And where would people find you? Where will people find what you do, what your work is? Please let.
Yeah. Appreciate that, Matthews. And I could put you on the spot and ask you something specific you're going to do to manage your own. So you did give yourself a couple of examples, spending time outside. And that's something I do encourage for everyone, is to disconnect on purpose, right? So we're always connected. I didn't talk about executive network and salient network and default mode network, but for people who want to have creative thinking, you need to let your mind wander and be daydreaming, right? So purposely having time when you go for a walk. If you've had a really good idea when you're in the shower, it's because you're purposely not being distracted by other things. That's your default mode network working. We don't build enough time for that in our modern world. Even when we go for a walk, we listen to a podcast. Even when we're driving, we listen to music. We're always filling that void. Even when you're standing in a queue somewhere, everyone's on their phone doing something. People don't just stand and look around and talk to each other anymore. So I think if you want to be, creative and have good health and be a good leader, building in some purposely disconnected time is good for that default mode network integration and creative thinking. So you're walking outside and looking at the birds and listening to sounds is a good tip for yourself.
Yes, I personally carry around a notebook.
Yeah, to find us.
I personally carry around a notebook, right around thoughts that come in mind. I mean, that helps a lot.
Yeah. People can find us. hbdinternational.com is where we are. We do total population workplace wellness, and we also do executive training and high performance stuff. And if you're interested in learning more, check us out. You can find me on LinkedIn, Andrew Stevenson. And I get around, I speak at conferences and things periodically, and I've done some writing here and there. But if you're interested in checking us out, reach out.
Perfect. I'll put everything in the description down below. Have a look at what Andrew is doing and HBD International. Thank you very much, Andrew. This has been wonderful. Till next time, I am Matthews, and this has been ITERA AI.